Imagine yourself as a Neapolitan noble in the 1500s. You're sitting atop of your castle, enjoying a nice glass of wine and a slice of medieval pizza. Tomatoes weren't invented yet, so it probably had rats as topping. As a feudal lord, you're essentially a mafia boss, able to reap juicy protection money from the peasants and merchants. Then, a Turkish boat appears.
Salam alaikum.
But it's not just any boat, it's a galley. Since the galley is powered by oars, he was able to outrun your sailing ships and could plunder them of all their goods. Then, a French galley appears.
Bonjour, monsieur!
Using his fleet of galleys, the French guy has just transported an army over that killed all your soldiers. Then, a Spanish galley appears.
Buenos dias.
Since the galley carries heavy cannons, it is able to obliterate your archaic castle walls. Suddenly, you can't defend yourself. Luckily, the Spaniards offered to protect you from the French and Turks, since you obviously can't do it yourself. Italy found itself in a rather precarious position, all thanks to the innovative tactics and weaponry of the Renaissance Galley. Galleys have been around in the Mediterranean since before recorded history. The ancient Romans and Greeks fought mighty battles at sea with their so-called triremes. The Byzantine Empire inherited the trireme and turned it into the dromon. Dromon means runner, emphasizing their focus on speed. Its most important innovation was its triangular sail, called the lateen, which allowed sailing almost against the wind. The Byzantine ship design spread to both the Catholic and Islamic worlds, and they would develop them in an almost identical fashion. During the medieval era, the Italian republics of Genoa and Venice produced the best galley fleets. However, the galley began falling out of favor in the 1400s. They weren't good merchant ships, since they couldn't carry a lot of cargo, needed a lot of crewmen, which had to be paid and fed, and could only carry enough provisions for a 4-day period. Neither were they good warships. During antiquity, sea battles were all about galleys just breaking into each other with metal rams. That had been abandoned by the Byzantines. In the Middle Ages, sea battles were just land battles, but on the water. There weren't any permanent navies, and fleets were mostly hired merchants meant to transport the army from point A to point B. Naval battles occurred when two transported armies met at sea and decided to duke it out in a large-scale boarding combat. Sure, galleys can do that, but people found out that if you just built a very tall boat, the boarding party from the galley just cannot climb up, unless if they want javelins, arrows and stones in their faces. So in the 1400s, the Mediterranean nations mostly used tall sail ships. Then, someone got a really bright idea. Hey, why don't we just take a cannon and slap it on a galley? Cool! But you can also put cannons on a sail ship, right? Yes, and it has often been argued that sail ships with broadside cannons were what killed galleys. This isn't true. The sail ships of the 1400s did have cannons. However, since the sail ship carried its cannons on the side, they had to be light. Otherwise, the recoil would destabilize the ship too much, maybe even make it capsize. Since cannons with wheels hadn't been invented yet, sail ship cannons either had to be reloaded from the outside, which is really dangerous, or had to be breech loaders. Breech loading cannons in the Middle Ages could only be fired with a smaller powder charge, and were weaker as a result. Sail ships of this time were rather rudimentary. They struggled with turning around, which isn't an issue in medieval sea battles centered around boarding. But in cannon battles, you constantly strive to get a superior angle on the enemy. Finally, sailing ships of this era were kind of round, meaning that all of its cannons couldn't be aligned on the same target at one time. Thank you, that's all. Basically, 15th century sail ships with cannons were pretty bad. Let's compare that to a galley with cannons. Galleys carried their cannons in the front, meaning that they fired wherever the galley was pointed. This made it much easier to aim direct fire. Compare pointing at something with your straight hand to pointing at something with the width of your forearm. That's a galley versus a sail ship. Since the recoil of these bow guns were transferred down the length of the ship, this meant that there were no risks of destabilization. Thus, galleys could carry much heavier cannons. The royal galley of King Fernando of Aragon carried 2 bombardas, monstrous pieces with bores like dinner plates. Not only could these cannons destroy other ships, but bombard coastal targets. Medieval castle walls were tall and thin. They were meant to hold off infantry attacks, not sustained artillery fire. Suddenly, naval warfare in the Mediterranean had changed completely. The rise of the galley meant the rise of powerful Mediterranean empires, the Spaniards and Ottomans, who were able to harness this new technology. We'll look into the political effects of the galley later on, but first I want to cover its construction a bit more. The most common galley of this era was called galea sotil by the Venetians. This basic construction didn't differentiate very much across the entire Mediterranean. You can only build a galley in so many ways. Neither was it very different from its medieval counterparts, only that it was heavier and slightly longer to accommodate for the artillery. It had a width of 5 meters, a draft of 1.2 meters. The weight had gone up from 140 to 200 tons, and the length from 38 to 41 meters. To compensate for the frontal weight of the artillery, counterweight balance had to be added in the back. Otherwise, the galley would just flip forward. It had a raised poop deck, funny poopy stink, where the ship was steered by 1 or 2 tillers, and the captain commanded. There was typically only one mast, rigged with a lateen sail. Sail power was not the main mode of propulsion, it was rowing. You might have noticed this weird outrigger sticking out the sides of the galley. It is a framework called the apostis, which was used to support the oars. The oars were of different length, and needed something to balance them. The apostis also served as a defense against ramming. Some galleys even carried shields along its sides that protected the rowers. This looks totally sick, but was abandoned in the early 1500s. Whilst the ram had been abandoned by the Byzantines, the galley did carry a metal-tipped spur at the bow. It could break the enemy's oars if you sailed up along them, but really it was meant as a boarding bridge. First you rammed into the side of the enemy galley, and then the lads rushed over across the spur. The biggest change in galley design, aside from artillery, was the change in how the boats were rowed. During the Middle Ages, every rower pulled his oar by himself. The most common system was alla sensile, where 3 rowers shared the same bench, but pulled their own oars. This system was slowly abandoned during the Renaissance, not because it was inefficient, but because it was expensive. More oarsmen increased the weight of the galley and the range in which it could operate, since it now needed to stop more often for provisions. A new system was developed where 3 rowers on a bench shared a single, larger oar. Only one oarsman needed any skill. He set the tempo, whilst the other 2 followed. This system, called alla scoloccio, was less efficient than alla sensile, but allowed slaves to be used instead. Slave galleys were a Renaissance thing, not medieval or even ancient. Galleys before the Renaissance were built with raised platforms, from which crossbowmen and archers could pepper the enemy. When cannons were introduced in the 1400s, it was pretty simple to convert these platforms to carry heavy cannon. If you wanted to add cannons to a sailing ship, you needed to cut out gun ports, a harder process than just slapping them into the bow of a galley. Around 1530, the galley cannons were fitted onto a sliding carriage system. Unlike later naval gun carriages, it lacked truck wheels. The carriage helped to absorb recoil and allowed the crew to reload it from safety. Before the sliding carriage, someone had to go outside of the platform, reducing reload speed and exposing themselves to enemy missiles. Galley design differed from country to country. The Venetians and Turks favored speed and maneuverability. The Barbary pirates emphasized close combat. The French and Knights Hospitallers favored the use of ordnance, as did the Spanish. Spanish war galleys were fitted out with a fighting platform atop of their gun platform, called arrumbada. It allowed their soldados to fire down on the enemy with arquebuses and swivel guns. Some of their galleys were fitted out with mortars on the poop deck and cannons between the oars, allowing a degree of broadside firepower. There were a few variations of the basic galley design, which I'll cover briefly in this section. Squadron and fleet commanders often used galleys which were larger and more heavily armed than usual. They were named lanternas, after the tree of large lanterns displayed at their stern, as a means of identification and signaling. Charles V of Spain owned a lanterna with 28 banks of oars and 208 oarsmen. Bastardas were smaller than the lanterna, but bigger than the average galley, and commanded by minor fleet commanders. By the late 16th century, it referred to most large, well-armed galleys. Since they were extremely cumbersome, they were augmented by 2 or even 3 masts. The Galea Grosse was first built during the Middle Ages. It was a large vessel designed to carry perishable or high-value cargo, and relied on speed rather than armament to avoid danger. They became associated with carrying pilgrims to the Holy Land. By the mid-1500s, it was replaced by the bastardas. The galeas is often seen as the ultimate evolution of the oared fighting ship. The Venetians built them to counter the bastardas of the Spanish fleet. They had 3 masts and a rounded forecastle in place of the gun platform, allowing it to repel enemies from several directions. The Spanish copied them rather quickly and added a square rig to them. A variety of smaller ore ships were vital for waging war in the Mediterranean. They were used for raiding, scouting, dispatches, and even participating in full-scale battles. The galliot had 18 oars per side and was both fast and maneuverable. It carried a single centerline gun and a small bank of swivels. It was faster than the Galea Sotil, and some even say superior. The fusta was a smaller variation of the galliot, but was undecked. Smallest was the bergantine. It carried no cannons, and each oar was pulled by a single rower. During battle, they were used to transport soldiers between the larger galleys. You see, when a galley got stuck in combat, it had a hard time disengaging. Since the crew was more valuable than the galley itself, it was built with these little stairs at the back, so a bergantine or galliot could just slide up and evacuate the defeated lads. Bergantines and fustas were both popular privateering vessels. The galleys themselves were very cheap to produce. It was the crew itself that was valuable. Whilst an infantry battalion could be drilled into an effective fighting force, the galley crew needed practical training, sometimes a lifetime of experience, to carry out effective operations. The crew consisted of sailors, oarsmen, soldiers, artisans, and officers. Artisans included the carpenter, the cook, doctor, etc., and I won't cover them. Sailors were freemen that could handle the sails and rigging. They were few in number. Whilst marine corps did not exist until the 1650s, the soldiers deployed aboard galleys were skilled in both fighting at sea and carrying out amphibious landings. The Spanish divided them into arquebusiers and spearmen. The Turkish and Algerian soldiers were called Gazis, holy warriors of Islam. Some of them were janissaries and carried both muskets and composite bows. The Hospitallers of Malta had crusading knights aboard, and they did a lot more pirating those days than they did protecting pilgrims. The most valuable group aboard were the oarsmen. During the Middle Ages, galley fleets were small and never permanent, so it wasn't expensive to hire large amounts of free oarsmen. But when the centralized states of the Renaissance Mediterranean began building large galley fleets, the price of skilled oarsmen became very high. The thing with galleys was that they were cheap to produce. A Spanish galley in the 1530s costed approximately 2,300 ducats to build. It cost 577 ducats to equip, provision, and pay the crew every month. The superpowers started looking to alternatives to cut their costs. Oarsmen in the 1500s can be divided into 3 subgroups, each with their advantages and disadvantages. Free seamen were more skilled. They could row the ship, handle the rigging, and could be trusted with weapons for a fight. They could even disembark as a land force. However, they were the most expensive. Slaves were cheap and expendable. They could be purchased, captured from the enemy, and you didn't have to pay them. However, they couldn't partake in fighting. Venice found a third alternative in national prisoners. They were able to work off debts or shorten their sentences. They weren't paid, but were otherwise treated like paid sailors, and could be trusted with weaponry. Venice also used a system of guild conscription to acquire oarsmen. Spain, the Knights of Malta, and Barbary pirates used slaves. Turkish oarsmen had low salaries, allowing the Ottomans to use a mix of conscripts, volunteers, paid Christians, and slaves. The conditions of the galley slaves was horrific and degrading. They were poorly clothed and susceptible to cold, intensive heat, and sunburns. Food came in small rations, and they were always chained to their benches, meaning that they couldn't walk around or go to the toilet. They had to do their business where they sat. Sailors reported that you could smell a galley a mile to the direction of the wind. Officers used scents and fragrances, to conceal the awful stink. Whilst the naval officer was virtually non-existent in Europe at this time, only a temporary thing, the Mediterranean world had a history of aristocrats choosing professional shipboard service as their career. It was rather easy for the galley powers to find commanding officers of their fleets. It was also common to appoint an infantry commander as captain, whilst a skilled sailor managed navigation. However, it took some time in France and Spain for galley officers to earn status amongst the nobility. Venice recruited its officers from its oligarchic families, whereas the Ottomans appointed skilled sailors or even privateers, such as Hayreddin Barbarossa. The galley fleet was able to rise thanks to the centralization that took place within France and Spain during the late 1400s. After decades of civil strife, the aristocrats of these countries decided to cooperate with the monarchy and participate in the state. This pooling of resources allowed the establishment of permanent armies and navies, which could be used to expand the power of those states. This created a snowball effect without any real start or end point, so it's hard to point out what caused what. For France, it meant taking over Italy. For Spain, it meant defending Italy from the French, but also from Turks and Barbary pirates. The Spanish Empire of the 1500s was so successful because it was a protection seller. In return, Italian states like Genoa and the Papal States provided the Spanish with even more galleys. In large-scale battles, the opposing fleets aligned in a line facing the enemy and duked it out in a drawn-out artillery duel. Boarding was risky and unpreferred since you couldn't easily disengage. This made communication difficult, and small galleys like fustas and bergantines were sent out between the larger ships to relay reinforcements or messages. Since retreat was impossible, the small galleys were used to evacuate their defeated crew. Larger galleys like the galeas were used as impregnable redoubts that could break the enemy formation. The Turks preferred defensive action and were good at combining maritime and land elements. The Venetians preferred a combination of speed and firepower. They preferred to keep a distance and fire at the enemy. The Spanish gladly invited close combat, where their powerful ordnance could deliver a single volley before their soldados were sent in on decisive boarding action. Now, naval battles in the 1500s are far out and in between compared to land battles. That might lead you to believe that the naval scene was unimportant, but that is far from the truth. Traveling by land before the railway was slow. Boats were much faster. The Mediterranean was the fastest form of communication, sending messages, trading, and transporting products or soldiers. If you could theoretically crush an enemy's fleet and blockade all of his ports, you'd blind him, cut out his tongue, make him deaf, and kill his dog for good measure. Controlling the Mediterranean was imperative to maintaining a stable and profitable empire. Most galleys actually lacked cannons. That's because galleys had other purposes than sea battles. Indeed, it was one of their least purposes. Most engagements were skirmishes and piratical raids. Instead, galley fleets were used for bombarding coastal targets, protection against pirates, and resupplying and transporting troops. In the 1490s, France used its galley fleet to transport reinforcements behind the Sicilian army, outflanking and defeating them. What made the galley so good was its wide array of usage. I mentioned what the Spanish and French did with their galley fleets. The Venetians used it to protect themselves and their trade. The Turks are very interesting. Of course, they made some attempts at conquering the Western Mediterranean, but most importantly, their galley fleet was used to protect the Eastern Sea from Christian fleets. This turned the Eastern Mediterranean into a Turkish lake, allowing them to do whatever they wanted in the Middle East, aka conquering everything, without Christian interference. Now is when we get into the boring stuff, logistics. A sail ship can carry lots of cargo and requires a smaller crew. This means that they can travel farther distances. Galleys require bigger crews and carry limited cargo. They could only travel 4 days before needing to resupply. Galleys also avoided sailing at night and were vulnerable to hard weather. Because of this, galley powers had to establish a chain of supply bases where their galleys could replenish and be given shelter. This gave galleys a close link to strategy. Conquering coastal territory opened up new opportunities for your galleys, but that territory might only be conquered with the help of galleys. When the Turks conquered Greece, they were able to chase out the Venetians from the entirety of the Eastern Mediterranean and open up Italy for conquest. Blockading was actually impossible with galleys, since they needed shelter and constant supplies. Whenever they attacked a coastal target, it was only to conquer it as a base. Spain set up a large series of bases on the North African coast, using their galleys, for their galleys. In the late 1400s, the Turks wanted to invade Italy. The Venetians were dependent on Turkish trade, and didn't want a war. However, the Turks needed a Venetian island as a supply base, and attacked it.
Non dire sciocchezze, ti sei bevuto il cervello. Chi si sognerebbe mai di attaccare un magazzino? Cosa?
You would have win, but you lose.
Thus, Venice was unwillingly dragged into that conflict. Galleys were also pretty slow. A galea sotile might achieve a maximum speed of 7 knots. It was impossible to maintain this speed for more than an hour, as the oarsmen became exhausted. Against a sail ship with good wind, the galleys couldn't compete. Galleys had risen to prominence because they could effectively carry out large-scale imperial operations. They were an easy way to integrate new gunpowder technology into the naval scene. Because of this, the Mediterranean powers were convinced that the galley was the only vessel viable in their inland sea. The year 1580 was decisive in the history of galleys. For one, sailing ships had now become better in terms of armament, construction, and rigging. Spain also signed a lasting truce with the Ottoman Empire, meaning an end to large-scale confrontations between Christian and Muslim fleets. Secondly, the King of Spain also became the King of Portugal, inheriting its powerful navy. The Portuguese had developed a strong fleet of gun-armed sail ships that could operate across entire oceans. Before this, a Spanish sailing fleet had been non-existent. All of their colonization and global trade had been managed by private interests. Suddenly, their focuses turned elsewhere, building a Spanish fleet which could defend its colonial empire and defeat its Atlantic enemies in France and England. With the Mediterranean at peace and Spain occupied elsewhere, its subjects that had once been dependent on Spanish protection were not so much anymore. Spain faced increasing resistance in Italy, and the Pope himself wanted them out. The sailing ship was becoming better and better than a galley. Suddenly they could outmaneuver them and outgun them. The English and Dutch were able to enter the Mediterranean and dominate trade. The previous galley powers had a hard time adapting. Venice and the Ottomans eventually opted to just purchasing foreign ships made in Northern Europe. Suddenly, the economic balance of Europe had shifted from Southern Europe to the north. The galley fell from prominence because it was an improvised, short-term solution and utilization of new technologies and systems. By 1550, the sailing ship had become superior for the building of empires, which were now on a global scale. The galley couldn't leave port for more than half a week, let alone do the trek to the East Indies. However, the galley still had its uses, and had been used outside of the Mediterranean. France and England had made great efforts to build powerful sailing fleets in the 1540s. Henry VIII built a massive Mary Rose as his flagship. However, France was able to prove the effectiveness of Mediterranean galleys in the English Channel. The sailing ships on both sides were clumsy and often suffered fatal accidents. The galleys were more maneuverable, and most naval battles of the Anglo-French War in 1545 devolved into skirmishes between French galleys and small English row barges. One of their experimental ship types were the roberge, light and medium-sized oared warships with guns fore and aft. The English started building their own galleasses as a counter to the French galleys. Sweden built a very effective galley fleet during the 1500s. Whilst it was smaller than its Mediterranean counterparts, the oarsmen were all soldiers who could disembark and fight on land. Theoretically, this quality over quantity system might have been superior to the Mediterranean use of slaves. In this contemporary depiction of the 1621 siege of Riga, we can see that the Swedish forces using galleys to bombard the city from the sea. The Spanish deployed only a few galleys during their invasion of England in 1588. They were soundly beaten. Perhaps they should have learned more from the French, who had, 40 years prior, used galleys to defeat the English in the shallow waters of the Channel. Galleys were continuously used for the rest of the Age of Sail, and were the best choice for explosive, short-range operations in shallow waters. They were used in the Franco-Spanish War in 1635. Spanish pirate hunters used them effectively in the Caribbean. The Swedish built an excellent galley fleet in the 1700s, called the Archipelago Fleet. Oars were mounted on some sail ships, like sloops and even frigates. But the galley's role as an instrumental tool for building empires was long since gone. If you enjoy the content I produce, consider supporting me monetarily on Patreon. You'll find the link in the video description. Otherwise, please give the video a like and a comment, so that YouTube will show it to more potential viewers. And why not share it with a friend? Cheers.